The Framework of a Christian State, An Introduction to Social Science, by Reverend E. Cahill, S.J. Chapter 2, Christian Society in the 5th Century. Freedom of the Church. After nearly 3 centuries of persecution, the Church was at last allowed to emerge from the catacombs. By the Edict of Milan, which was promulgated in 313 AD over the names of the joint emperors Constantine and Licinius, and the several supplementary edicts issued by Constantine himself when he became sole master of the Roman world, Christianity, which had by that time permeated every class of Roman society, got legal recognition and even official encouragement within the empire. Nearly another century of varying vicissitudes had to elapse before it was established under Theodosius the Great, died 395, as the religion of the state. Society only partially Christianized. A considerable portion of the people were still pagan, and even among large sections of the Christians, many pagan customs and unchristian principles rooted in an unbroken tradition of 1,000 years continued to retain their hold. Even Roman law had not yet fully put off its pagan characteristics. Still, both laws and customs had already undergone a profound change in the early half of the 5th century, and the Theodosian Code, which was compiled about 430 AD, shows that Christian principles had then gained a definite mastery in the Roman world. Supremacy of the divine law. To begin with, the absolute supremacy of the state and the unchecked despotism of its ruler were no longer acknowledged even in civil law. By the fundamental principles of Christian teaching, there is a higher law against which no human authority can prevail. The eternal law of God binds emperor, citizen, and slave with the same force. This principle was now definitely recognized. Hence, even slaves were now allowed rights of conscience with which slavery in the old sense was incompatible. Rights attaching to human personality. Again, in opposition to the teaching of the Greco-Roman philosophy and the spirit of the old Roman law, the essential dignity and inalienable rights of the human person, no matter how poor or weak, were now at least partially recognized. According to Christian teaching, all, whether slaves or Romans, women or men, infants or adults, being children of the same Father, predestined to the same eternal end, and redeemed by the same Savior, have by their nature indefeasible rights and inalienable responsibilities which no human law can make void. For under the Christian law there is, as St. Paul writes, neither Jew nor Greek. There is neither bond nor free. There is neither male nor female, for you are all one in Christ. Galatians 3:28. In enforcing this principle, not only was the Church confronted with prejudices rooted in the pagan tradition, but the whole framework of the social organism, which was fashioned on a pagan philosophy, had to be recast. Such a reform was necessarily slow. Still, even the century after the freedom of the Church was first declared witnessed substantial progress. Thus, in the case of women, minors, slaves, prisoners, and the poor, the Church insisted from the very beginning that their essential rights be fully recognized, and she exerted her whole influence that all their other natural rights be gradually conceded. Reforms in Roman law. The right of life and death, which, by the old Roman law, the master had over his slaves and the father over his children, is withdrawn in the Theodosian Code. Children are allowed emancipation from the parents' control when they reach a certain age. Girls over 18 years of age can marry of their own free choice, and are allowed also the free disposal of their property. Slaves are allowed rights and facilities to acquire property, and many provisions are made protecting them against the injustice of tyrannical masters. Many evidences also now appear of the more humane attitude of Roman law towards the poor and weak. Thus, the bishops are accorded extensive powers of arbitration in disputes, and in several other ways are enabled to protect the poor against oppression. When the parties to a dispute agreed to choose the bishop as arbitrator, the civil judge was bound by law to enforce his decision. The bishop also visited the prisons to see that the prisoners were properly treated. The provincial governors took their oath of office at the bishop's hands, and after their period of office gave an account of their administration before him. Churches, and later on even houses in the vicinity of the church, were accorded rights of asylum, where those accused of crime might take refuge, and be thus safeguarded against precipitate punishment or personal vengeance. Hospitals endowed from public funds were established for the poor, and special houses of refuge were opened for orphans, widows, and poor travelers. The inhuman custom of gladiatorial combats, in which hundreds and thousands of men slaughtered one another in the arena for the amusement of the people, was forbidden by Constantine about 313 AD. But owing to the opposition which this measure aroused, it was not enforced till 404 AD. The abolition of gladiatorial combats was brought about by the heroic martyrdom of the monk Telemachus, who rushed into the arena to separate the combatants and was immediately stoned to death by the populace. Owing to the profound impression created by this incident, the Emperor Honorius was enabled to suppress finally these inhuman exhibitions in Rome. The example set by the Christians. Among the Christians themselves, slaves and the poor were regarded, in contrast with the old pagan ideals, as the equals of the rich in human dignity and personal responsibility. They were treated with special kindness by the Church, while in the Christian homes, all the members of the family, including the slaves, were united by close ties of charity and piety. The principles regulating men's duties towards one another form another feature of Christian teaching which clashed with the social ideals of pagan Rome. In the latter, self-interest and self-gratification were recognized as the fundamental consideration, while the Christian ideal is summed up in the words of Christ, "Thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself." Matthew 22:39. And again, "A new commandment I give unto you, that you love one another as I have loved you." John 13:34. The practice of justice and charity which this law includes marked the mutual relations of the early Christians, and extended itself even to those outside the Christian fold. Such an example exerted an immense influence in the whole social life of Rome, and made itself felt in almost every detail of life. The new concept of ownership. Finally, one of the most important and revolutionary of the new principles introduced by Christianity was the Christian concept of private ownership. This was directly opposed to the non-Christian idea. According to Christian teaching, the human owner of material goods is merely a steward in the service of the supreme owner who is God. Hence, the wealthy proprietor is bound by the law of Christ, and in those days he fully recognized his obligations to give for the relief of the needs of others what remained over after his own reasonable needs were satisfied. He was taught, too, that his own wants were to be interpreted rather strictly, excluding luxuries and even unnecessary comfort and convenience. During the early centuries of Christianity, preachers and writers were accustomed to emphasize these obligations very strongly. They insisted a good deal upon the duties and limitations of ownership and upon the fundamental right of all to their due measure of access to the material goods of the world. Although there is no proof that communism prevailed in the early church or that the teachings of any of the early fathers were opposed to the institution of private property, the mere fact that many non-Catholic writers can assert with a certain show of plausibility that such was the case is sufficient to prove how strongly Christian moralists and preachers insisted upon the limitations and responsibilities of ownership. Among the Christians themselves, the ideals of the gospel were very largely realized, and as the Christians formed in the 5th century the vast majority of the population, their influence profoundly affected the whole tone of society. Marriage. Among the Christians, the marriage tie was then, as now, inviolable and perpetual, and the marital obligations of husband and wife mutual. Even in Roman law, although divorce and concubinage still continued to obtain recognition, both were placed under strict limitations. Divorce was made very difficult. The law discouraged it, and civil equality was established between husband and wife in all their essential marriage obligations. The social status of women. The pagan idea of the essential inferiority of women was reprobated, and a completely new ideal of womanhood was upheld. The Christian matron is a type quite unknown to the pre-Christian Romans. She is the close friend and companion of her husband, to whom she is bound by ties which death alone can sever. She is the educator of the children and the mistress of the home in which her position is secure. The important role assumed by the Christian matron in all works of charity and benevolence was also a new phenomenon. Finally, The special place set apart in the Christian law for virgins consecrated to God contributed to give to the Christian woman a dignity and a standing that were in striking contrast with pre-Christian ideas. So completely indeed had the influence of Christianity revolutionized the attitude of the Romans towards their women that we find Pulcheria, sister of Theodosius II, acting as her brother's regent and guardian and succeeding him as empress after his death, 450 A.D. The Roman slaves. The abolition of slavery was perhaps the greatest and most decisive triumph of Christianity in the social life of the people. That the disappearance of slavery among the European nations was a result of Christian principles is recognized by all historians. As the morning rays of Christianity, writes Dr. Sigerson, fell upon the nations, they first dispelled the darker clouds of slavery, and then, as the light prevailed, bondage passed away. This happened more or less rapidly in different localities, as mountains may be seen illuminated with sunshine, while the valleys at their feet are still in the shade. The slave question was the most troublesome and thorny of all the difficulties that the Church had to deal with. To liberate the slaves at once, even if it were possible, would mean a social upheaval, the result of which no one could foresee, and would have been fatal even to the interests of the slaves themselves. The numbers of slaves were immense, and the institution of slavery was deeply rooted in the manners, the ideas, and the whole social life of the people. Hence the Church had to proceed slowly and cautiously. The Church's mode of procedure. Christianity, writes Lecky, broke down the contempt with which the master regarded his slaves and planted among the slaves themselves a principle of moral regeneration, which expanded in no other sphere with equal perfection. Its action in procuring the freedom of slaves was unceasing. The Church reprobated the false idea that manual work is degrading. She insisted on the duty and the necessity of labor for all, and on the well-grounded self-respect which the practice of labor gives. She preached the equality of all in natural dignity, in personal responsibility, in the participation of heavenly graces, and in the predestination to eternal happiness. While preaching to the slaves the duty of obedience to the master's just commands, because the master's authority at the time was necessary for the common good, and consequently sanctioned by the divine will, she also insisted strongly on the duties of masters towards their slaves, and had her preaching sanctioned by canonical enactments and very severe penalties. Outside of what was essential for the needs of existing society, the Church acknowledged no distinction between slave and freeman. All had the same sacraments. The marriage of slaves among themselves had the same sanction as that of the free. Clerics of servile origin were numerous, and so leveling was the Christian principle of personal equality that the chair of Peter was sometimes filled by men born of slaves, such as Pius in the 2nd century and Callistus in the 3rd. In the Christian cemeteries there is no distinction between the tombs of slaves and those of the free. Above all, the Church prepared the way for the eventual abolition of slavery. The liberation of slaves was endowed with special ecclesiastical favor. It was usual to perform the ceremony of manumission in the Church, and the bishop was accorded by civil law special powers to facilitate it. The Church also took liberated slaves under her special protection, and strictly forbade that they should be in any way again reduced to servitude. Under the influence of the Church, the state also made many other enactments to facilitate the manumission of slaves. The movement was further supported by the example of Christian masters who frequently set free their whole households of slaves. Besides all this, the general attitude of the Christians towards their slaves and towards the poor set an example which profoundly affected the whole tone of Roman society. Results of the Church's influence. If the Roman state had been allowed to develop on the new lines thus marked out, the 6th century A.D. would probably have seen the complete liberation of the slaves and the establishment of a fully developed Christian social regime. The downfall of the Western Empire checked the development of Christian civilization in Western Europe, although in the Eastern Empire the movement still continued. Enough, however, was already done, even in the West, to permeate the fabric of Roman law with Christian principles. This law became later on the groundwork of the legal systems of the European kingdoms which grew out of the Teutonic invasions that now swept over Europe.